Yeah, if you want your dinner, then please stay. I can keep, otherwise, no. So we are starting with this last session, social identity and work, the changing social lives of work. So I'm sorry I was not here for the other session, so I don't know how to weave it into the other discussions which have taken place. So without wasting more time, I'll go straight to. Are you ready, or should we start with you?
No, let's start with her.
Yeah, so let's start with Dr. Lizzie Richardson, who is from Durham University, and then we'll go to, is you connected to her somewhere? No, then okay, thank you.
Hello. Okay, I'm not going to say too much because there's been a lot of talking, so I'll just go sort of straight into it. What I'm going to say picks up a bit on some of the themes that were talked about earlier in terms of industrial decline, and my research has mainly been looking at recently the kind of transformations to work in the UK in relation to a new form of kind of industry called digital industries, and in particular related to the digitalization of information and communication technologies. And rather than really focusing on labour per se, what I'm interested in, because my training is in human geography, has been in the changes to the kind of spaces and kind of times of work. So we see a shift from forms of kind of fixed spaces and workplaces, and that's a bit what I'm going to talk about today in relation to the kind of contemporary discourse of flexibility in the UK. And this taps into, I think, what was talked a bit about earlier in terms of the kind of informalization of work in the workplace. Okay, so firstly, what is meant then by a discourse of flexibility? Well, for our purposes, what I'm referring to is the prevailing or common vocabularies surrounding work and labour in the UK. And this is particularly linked to the possibilities for the self-organisation of work, not exclusively, but often through digital technologies. So there are a couple of common examples here, some of which have already been referred to. The one that I put up here is flexible work in the gig economy. So a typical example in the UK would be delivery, which is a bit like Zomato here, I think. A company with a technology platform that allows customers to order food from restaurants to be delivered from their location. And the workers delivering the food are self-employed contractors, post-Fordism. But what I've been particularly interested in is how digital technologies have enabled this flexibility to kind of manifest on a small or local scale through which is an operator of a flexible office space in London. So we have on the one hand these kind of flexible gig workers, then we have flexibility also manifest in a supposedly more kind of formal office context of office space. So one of the things that becomes immediately apparent then from these two examples is that the discourse of flexibility can refer to quite different sorts of work and working conditions. Somebody working in an office job is not only more likely to be carrying out mental rather than manual labour, but also potentially has greater earnings and a different contractual status to a food delivery rider. However, although flexibility doesn't imply one single condition of work, what it does broadly suggest is that workers' working activities and indeed their kind of identity as workers are not fixed in time and or space. So that is, for example, workers do not have an open-ended or permanent status working for a given organisation, or workers do not have to stick to fixed hours of work, or have to do work in a given workplace in order to be counted as being at work. And much of the kind of contemporary understanding of flexibility in the UK, so the contemporary is in the last, I'd say, 5 years, maybe 10 years, as opposed to the 1980s, 1990s, so the kind of, you could say, the emergence of neoliberalism, actually derives from the Children and Families Act of 2014, which extended the right to request flexible working to all employees. a right that had previously only existed to parents and carers. So the statutory right to request flexible working entitles qualifying employees, so it's kind of up to the employer who counts as a qualifying employee, to apply to their employers for a change to their terms and conditions of employment relating to their hours, times or locations of work. And so the change could include, for example, working part-time, from home, or compressed hours. There are a variety of things that are encompassed by flexible working. And employers may only refuse the request for flexible working on grounds defined in legislation, for example, the burden of additional cost or a detrimental effect on the ability to meet customer demand. So I've just put up here a quote which is from the Modern Workplaces consultation that informed this 2014 Act by the UK government. And I'm not going to read it all out, but I think there are three kind of things to note here. Firstly, that flexible working is understood as empowering for workers to enable them to become agents in both their working and other, i.e. personal, private lives. And then secondly and relatedly, this statement posits flexibility as a way of delinking participation in society from paid work for an employer. So your kind of social status is not linked to your status as a worker or necessarily as a worker in a workplace with fixed hours and a fixed space of work. This, of course, is important both from the point of view of the historically significant role of trade unions as institutions for social and political participation in the UK, but also from the point of view of the role of unpaid work, historically predominantly of women, that was in earlier times not recognised by these types of politics. And then the final point is that there's a kind of clear attempt to cast flexible working as beneficial for businesses, as I've kind of already indicated and we'll come back to. So the understanding of flexibility as something that is beneficial for workers is at least in part enshrined in UK legislation. And in recent years, much of the contemporary politics around work in the UK has revolved around the question of whether flexibility offers workers greater agency, for example, through enabling them to do other things besides work, to manage their own work, or whether flexibility gives workers less agency. So, for example, through making them work more, work more kind of uncertain hours and have less certain kind of contractual conditions, etc. So, in other words, although work may be flexible in terms of its times or locations, workers have different degrees of agency in terms of choosing this flexibility. So there's a sense of flexibility being somewhat contradictory and empowering, but also potentially disabling. And perhaps the most recent significant studied response to the contradictory nature of flexible working was an independent report commissioned by the UK government Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And this is the title of the report, Good Work, the Tailored Review of Modern Working Practices. This was published in 2017. And the report was really something of a kind of disappointment, I think, for those seeking more government regulation to ensure that good work is provided, as this was really explicitly not recommended. So the idea that the government should intervene was not present in the report. But it did nonetheless make, from a kind of Labour politics point of view, some kind of progressive suggestions. For example, that those working for platform-based companies such as Uber and Deliveroo be classed as dependent contractors rather than independent contractors, implying that these companies need to offer some kind of basic security, such as insurance, for example. Underpinning the critique of flexibility is a suggestion that conditions of work are somehow regressing. So, in the UK context, the gains made in terms of the post-Second World War protections for UK workers are being further eroded, and this, as I've suggested, has been the case since the late 1970s, early 1980s. And a 2018 report into the conditions of work for gig economy workers for the company Deliveroo, food delivery platform, by a Labour member of Parliament, pointed out that flexible work is only desirable for some workers. There are large numbers of workers who would like to be able to, or indeed trying to earn a stable income through the platform, rather than, but rather instead have the kind of uncertainty of not knowing whether they'll get any shifts. And the report I mean, kind of from a sort of labour history point of view, this is not surprising, but this was picked up in the press in the UK because the report, in fact, compared the conditions of Deliveroo's workers to that of casual labour practices in British dockyards until the kind of mid-20th century. And this is the quote that I put up here, where workers would gather around the dock gate, desperately hoping that they would be offered work, and only certain workers were fortunate enough to receive work. So we have this sense then that flexibility is somehow regressive on the one hand, but to return to the 1980s, flexibility was initially associated with efficiency and indeed new and more progressive modern technologies of work. And this discourse, this is still kind of present in the discourses around technology and flexibility today. So a variety of uses of the term flexibility arose in the 1980s to describe a number of changes to production, largely based empirically in the UK context on alterations to the car industry, and this was broadly termed post-Fordism. And flexibility was understood as vital to this transformation from kind of Fordist modes of production to post-Fordist, which I won't go too much into. But at this time, flexible technologies were not sort of the mobile handheld technologies that we're referring to today, but nonetheless were connected to the digitalization of information and communication. So the idea that production could be much more responsive, at that point this was called kind of just-in-time production. There was also, at this time, the emergence of, as well as flexible technologies, the use of the phrase flexible labour, which was kind of used within sort of company discourse in two ways. One was enhanced functional flexibility, so kind of using the same worker to perform a variety of tasks. So this could perhaps be understood as a reskilling. And then also numerical flexibility, perhaps the kind of flexibility of labour power, the ability of a company to kind of adjust the kind of aggregate quantity of labour they were using in production. And I think whilst some would certainly argue that post-Fordism was more a caricature than an empirical reality, it nonetheless was formative in setting out flexibility in academic and to some extent in popular discourse as a characteristic of labour in general, and to a lesser extent of the individual worker, which is the sort of contemporary understanding of flexibility in the UK context, this of the individual worker. And post-Fordism also, though, linked flexibility to kind of characteristics of technology. So you no longer had kind of hard, fixed industrial technology, but rather technology was being understood increasingly as something that was flexible, something that offered, through improvements of information communication, faster, more efficient forms of production. At the same time as the new flexible technologies were held to improve the productivity and responsiveness of production in general, at the level of the individual worker, the increased kind of flexibility of technologies was also related to femininity and to new working activity or practices that would suit a female workforce in comparison to the more kind of masculine, hard industrial technologies. And I think we can find something thinking along these lines, in fact suggested by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. I think I put the quote up there. So the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labour of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex no longer have any distinctive validity for the working class. I've also put up here this quote by Sherry Turkle from a very different perspective, sociologist of technology, who talks about how the kind of interactive nature, this was in the late 80s, early 90s, the interactive nature of computers and the possibilities to have kind of digital avatars required a kind of much softer mode of engagement that existed on sort of a non-hierarchical style that encouraged negotiation, relationships and attachment. Some of the kind of underpinnings of contemporary sort of social media vocabularies. And she links this approach particularly to characteristics of femininity. So whilst in many ways contemporary digital technologies that had their antecedents in the 1980s remain heavily linked to men who are involved in coding, software design and so on, we can see that flexibility as kind of extending female conditions of work to the workforce more generally. And this is a kind of quote from Haraway here. I just want to talk briefly about this, mention briefly that this kind of relationship between flexibility and femininity also overlaps with other kind of weaker populations, historically weaker populations, particularly those of immigrants and non-white immigrants to the UK who have underpinned this independent workers' union of Great Britain. I think I've pretty much run out of time. Yeah, I just will conclude. I just will conclude by finishing with this quote by Pollitt, who was kind of critiquing the discourse of flexibility in the 1980s, and she was sort of early in noting how this was being used as a legitimatory tool in management discourses by companies for a variety of undesirable practices. But she also noted that the tension between the discipline of wage labour and the rhythm of life outside this social relation has been a source of conflict throughout the development of capitalism. And I think this is kind of one of the things that's at stake at the moment in the UK from a variety of different perspectives. Flexibility as a form of modernisation is often sold as a positive thing, in which the prevailing utopian image is no longer freedom from work, but freedom to work, albeit at times and in locations that are personally convenient. And it's this new kind of work style, understood as a sort of a style of work and a stylisation of work, that labour politics and trade unions are having to, or to some extent, I think in the UK, failing to adjust.
I'm a bit sorry, I'm kind of presenting a paper, but I will try to develop a bit more the literature review and the situation in the fields of anthropology and sociology of labor. I changed in the title was Flexible Identity in the Indian Class of Labor. In the case of Bhopal's metal workers, it would be more flexible ethoses. I will explain it, I will come back to it. So this is a paper that I'm going to submit normally next Monday, to the French journal Sociology of Sociologie du Travail, Sociology of Labor. And it's the urban part of my PhD fieldwork, where I was comparing workers from the suburbs in Bhopal, which live very close to the ruins of a Union Carbide factory responsible for the 1984 disaster, with rural workers working on flyover construction yards, and so there are migrants coming to work in the flyovers to Bhopal. There, I want to do a kind of counter-narrative, in the sense that the imaginaries have been really overwhelmingly shaped by the Bhopal disaster. Be that global or national, it's a symbol of the entrance of mankind in Anthropocene, a symbol of the consequences of industrial risks, and very simply of criminal capitalism. But I wanted this paper to be more focused, in my research in general, on anthropology of labor. So, why do I want to do that? The first goal would be to disessentialize, in fact, the people of Bhopal as being victims of the disaster. I'll come back to it, but there are many other worries. And so the goal is to take into account what I would call a class culture. How do I define it? Like, what are the ethoses and sense of cultural construction? I use the Bourdieu's definition, so objectively and systematic set of disposition with ethical dimension of practical principles. So it's practical embodiment of values and norms, and then it's also the layout of class or work identity, of course, if you mobilize them in a reflexive way. So work developed in by Bhopal's metal workers in response to their experience of domination, to their confrontation with material and with physical uncertainty. So, on this methodology, I really want to not essentialize people as working class, and their culture as a class culture, or even worse, as a culture of poverty. And then I will enter a bit in the debate, the ongoing debates in anthropology of labor in India, especially in the informal sector. So we have said already many times that there is a global loose on labor, generally, labor rights, on labor unions' voices. So we are getting more towards flexibilized or informalized labor, and this causes the Marxian conception of a unionized Fordian working class to be not operant anymore. So of course, there's been a debate. For example, if I go to the UK, a guy standing tried to defend this new class as a precariat, and he was pretty well criticized for having made a very essentialist new category, so a bit similar to the old legacy culture of poverty. And if I go in the UK side, I could quote Jens Lerke and Al Pasha, which are not British but are working in SOAS, and I take a bit their conceptual frame, which would be to take into account the intermingling of caste, class, and gender domination in order to have a multi-angle analysis. They use the concept of conjugated oppression, which they take from Balibar, but I won't enter into the details. But the question is to overcome the old Marxist and Marxian conception of a class, especially Jens Lerke is using Henri Bernstein to overcome the questions of neo-feudality or semi-proletariat, and to have a non-theological analysis, which is disessentializing the relationship to class and the question of class culture. So that's why I anchor this to the very practical experiences of domination. So that's for the introduction. So the 1984 disaster, I go quickly on it for those who are not aware. And it's an accident which happened in a pesticide making factory owned by Americans. And it's a case of criminal negligence. It has been pretty well demonstrated, but they were not able to demonstrate, the Indian state was not able to demonstrate it in the court. So that's why it ended by a settlement in 1989 for the payment of $470 million, which is not huge because the number of victims was sorry, I said 2 times used, but the number of victims was huge. So it's between 3,000 to 22,000 deaths following the diverse estimation, and between 200 and 500,000 injured, which represented, in the end of the day, somehow $500 per person. Okay. Then there was a second disaster, which is very important for my fieldwork, is that the company let the factory rot practically but directly, which led to the poisoning of the soils and of underground water. So people living in the Basti surrounding the factory's ruins drank poisoned water until the 2000s, so from 2004 to 2011, clean water, I mean regular water, arrived from the Bhopal municipality. And when I started my fieldwork in 2011, a majority of the Bastis people were provided with, I would say, normal water. So, for this, when I arrived, whatever we can say of the struggle or the small overcompensation, I mean, the disaster was already a bit a part of the memory. Even if the struggle is ongoing, since 2010 there was a reclamation of another batch of compensation, there are demonstrations every year, but still people had other worries. There are other traumas as well. For example, I was working in a Muslim neighborhood. A very important trauma was the riots, which followed Mumbai, and which totally reframed the city's Bastis in Hindus and Muslim Bastis, and it polarized the city into communities. Also, their daily experience of domination was a lot about relationship to state and relationship to employment, or would I say the lack of employment. So this is why I started I would say classical anthropology of work, of labor, following mostly men, because it was really a male-ish work, in the metal workshops, which were the main source. It was not a cluster, not Bhopal, but it was still one of the main sources of employment. So, these metal workshops were divided in 3 branches. First one, fabrication of metal furniture. Second one, repairing, engineering. And third one, bus body making, okay? I'll go quickly on the main features of the industry because it's pretty classical and it looks a lot like, for example, a situation described by Jan Breman. So a very close industry. You couldn't get into it if you were not introduced by a friend or a family member. Of course, systems of cars and periphery, and you have to be close to the owner to be kept regularly, if not you're laid off when there is a lack of orders. What was a bit more peculiar was the unevenness and the irregularity of the trajectories. I mean, if you see Breman's work, he would say that social mobilities are pretty difficult, or almost impossible, in the informal sector. Here, at least situational mobilities were very frequent, but the problem was to secure them. For example, I followed a lot Umar, which was a ticketer and a mystery at the time I met him. And I mean, it's like you would learn the job, and then you could get skilled, and even get to some point of your career when you are even able to bargain. So to put some owners in concurrence to have you, and then you could fall into unemployment, be up again, maybe try to make your own workshops. I had many cases like this. The workshop crashes, you fall in unemployment again. Not to mention the people which are totally out of the course in one domain, so have to change the branch, and then you have to relearn another job. For example, if you pass from metal workshop to wood workshop, and then it's another fall. So of course, all this is determined by your reputation. Everyone knows each other, and your reputation is your first security. So your reputation is a mix of recognition of your skills and recognition of your moral or general qualities as a worker. What was also peculiar was, because it was not at all the same with migrant-free work, was the persistence of very strong and very visible everyday resistances. There were no collective resistances, there were no unions almost. But then there were a lot of negotiations within work, and also a lot of, shouting as well sometimes, a lot of violence, not really physical violence, but a lot of oral violence. And from the Maliks to the workers, but also the other way around. Several ethoses were used as grounds to contest. The first one would be the ethos of assistance. If you have to assist, especially if you're a family, even a distant sibling, to find employment, what someone is in the peripheries. But in general, for sickness, for marriages, some worker could mobilize the fact that his owner could assist him a bit. Other ethos, and if I have time, because I think I cut half of the presentation, is the question of skilling, which is because you can contest the hierarchies on the ground that you know better how to do the job. And this means that the hierarchies are fixed, but they can be contested. You can't contest a mystery, a supervisor for the non-defense, and you could contest him if he's having a bad technical choice. And if it's proved wrong, it's a loss of honor for him. So this is particularly peculiar, so I'll jump to the second part on the skills, because I agree to rush. And so that's overwhelming importance of the skills, not only to contest hierarchies as an instruments, because skills are super important in your reputation, made it for me not even a bunch of hypotheses, but really an ethic of work, where the skills are validated by a kind of co-constructed opinion of your colleagues, and even honors, when they don't have technical skills, they can be contested on this. And this was the ground of a strong also working identities by branches which compare between themselves and which one is the most skilled, and within the branch, in the hierarchies. And it said, for example, you have a Ustad Shagir, Ustad helper structure, not formal. It's not a guild, but still the discourse is the one who taught you always use that you have to show him respect, and that in general, it's that, respect honor. You have to show respect to the people who are skilled. And there is all an interest on skill. Even the order givers, for example, the bus owner, they will be interested on how someone finds a technical solution, and also the delays, which are crystallizers of tensions, because everything is late, the payments, the processes are also negotiated on the ground of technical problems. So I remember Omar arguing to a bus owner, or it was very difficult technically to repair the bus while he was smoking ganja just 1 hour before. But I mean, these are grounds of resistance. And also there is a symbolic path, I think, between the end of the mind, because when it's less value skills, it's Atkakan, also work by the end, and when it's most value skills, is said work by the brain, and there is a hierarchy. There is also valorization then of people who say that they do Dimakaka, the work of the brain, that they could call themselves sometimes technical engineers, and they would say that even if you don't know how to read and write, you have a brain, and they know to do this work. And I think it's peculiar, it was both fieldworks, but peculiar to India, because I thought it was a question in France to craftsmen and all, and they would say, of course you need your brain to make furniture, but they insist that it's handiwork. I didn't see this kind of proposition. Then other important points, and I'll touch on that, is that these pluralistic ethoses are of course shaping masculinities. And okay, thanks. So they're shaping their masculinities and legitimizing the exclusion of women. And I'll jump on the last point very quickly. But this only works in the productive sphere. In the reproductive sphere, there is the centrality, as said Rukmini, of the man as a breadwinner. And as the employment is irregular, these guys are not breadwinners. And often they have, like Umar was shamed by his wife until he cries, and they are shamed by the family. You say you have Pareshani there, because they are not considered as men, plainly. Because they fail to win the bread. So I jump on the discourses which highlight a vision of class condition, but based on the daily employment, Mazduli, opposed to Nokli, seen not as Nokli, like only public service reward, but as a vision which is more diffuse of regular and valuable work. Then you still have the dream to become rich, of independence, but in fact, everybody can make his own workshop, but generally only the inheritance of the owners, or the ones who have capital, land, can succeed, really. And at last, I finish by the economy number 2, because there is a prevalence of delinquency, and some youth also kind of repair these broken masculinities by valorizing also the possibility to use violence, to bear violence in a lot of that. I can't give examples on that, and I jump directly to the conclusion, saying that what I wanted to show, in fact, I don't have time, it's not like an argument which will say something on this class culture, but it is all you have a multiplicity of ethoses, which are sometimes contradictory. For example, this ethos of praxeology, there is a tension on this ethos and the will always to educate the children that will get an outlet. This ethos of masculinity, which express themselves by some kind of machist conception of work, also in the Buddhism, and at the same time, people which are proud of like when they could have friends who have a nokri and be also very proud of them. Like fathers could be also proud of sons who have nokris and other ones which have reskilled at workshops. And so, what I mean is that the richness, complexity and unevenness of this all ethoses do not contradict the existence of a class conscious and of a class culture which is based on a common experience of subalternity. And for a sentence, I would quote Tikeda from the Bastille, who told, okay, we are all Hindus and Muslims, we are all the same in the workshop, we are labor class, but we cannot unite. And use labor class in English because I'm not so good in Hindi, that I not very well, that is aware of what the class contrast is. Thanks, I'm sorry for...
For staying all this day here. I try to be quick and refreshing, but I don't know if I will manage. Because, but in a certain way, I'm really happy to present here and also maybe to be the last presenter because I will not dive into a specific particular case study now, maybe like in the beginning, but I would like to invite you to discuss with me my argument of how to build comparative perspectives on what is called informal and precarious work, and that is a comparison or a comparative perspective that crosses divides in knowledge production in Western or in the North Atlantic and beyond, and I think that is a very important task for us as social scientists, and I'm coming from the discipline of sociology, so I'm used to work more theoretical than maybe anthropologists do, and I also don't take into account now in depth the historical perspective and everything, but I would like to invite you to think with me together on how we can understand marginal work in comparative perspectives, and I draw on my doctoral thesis that has compared workers in digital economies in Berlin and Abidjan. And before I start, I think maybe you can think of the entire day, and I think three elements that we had throughout the entire day that will come in my reflections are at first what we had in the last panel, the importance of the symbolic in the economy, or the symbolic economies that weave throughout a lot of accounts that you have shared. Second, the widening of the perspective or the articulation of your labor position, your position in the labor market or as laborer, and the wider social life and your positions in as gendered positions, your urban, rural, all these other positions that matter. And third, that we need to be careful by equating labor law with labor protection. I think that's a very fruitful perspective also to build comparative frameworks, because that sometimes is a bit of Eurocentrist idea that okay, law is always in the for the people. I will start with introducing or giving some accounts of my fieldwork. I will just read out some empirical vignettes and then I start with the theoretical part. Sitting next to me in a hip bar restaurant in Berlin, Tobias sips a smoothie. His full black hair is tamed by a thin hairband, and his neon yellow tracksuit top goes well with the colorful lights and artsy atmosphere in the bar. Berlin is the place to become an independent filmmaker. I dream of creating my own stories, he says enthusiastically. Tobias moved to Berlin after he failed his A-levels and quit school. Since in his hometown, he explains, there really wasn't anything going on. Only old people still live there. Everything is different in Berlin though, and there are unexpected twists of fate. So far, instead of shooting films, Tobias earned a living cycling around the city. He is a part-time bicycle courier at a startup that delivers food to office workers and the homes of middle-class families. To him, it is just a temporary way to get by. Next month, I probably look for something else. Maybe I start some film projects for real. I meet Marian sitting at a street corner in his neighborhood where he has set up a small table as a desk together with Alain, a friend on whom he relies to make the business work. They were both young men in their 20s who lived in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire's economic hub. Marian dreams of joining public service, preferably as a police officer. For now, while waiting, he works selling airtime to passers-by. A huge sun umbrella does its best to protect him from the sun and rain. The particular color of the umbrella, branded with the logo of a telecommunications firm, distinguishes him from all the other pedestrians and vendors on the street. Behind his desk, Marian wears a light-colored shirt and denims, the look of a typical Abidjanese student, complete with glasses. He just has finished A-levels and tried to pass the entrance exam to public service, but in vain. So he spends the entire day here, 6 days a week, always available to refill SIM cards and provide on-site access for making phone calls. At least Marian likes to manage his things alone and to be his own boss. This way, he can call it a day whenever he likes. So Marian and Tobias are young urbanites, you see here on the map where cities are located, who try to make ends meet by selling airtime with their mobile phones and delivering food for an online platform with their bikes. So just to give some background information, we already heard about the delivery platforms that you introduced. It's working similar. They deliver food and work with an app that shows them the way where they have to go. So they are tracked all the time and have on-demand gigs. In Germany, they can work as freelancer, as part-time employees, and also as full employees. So it's a bit different than maybe in the UK. And in Abidjan, they also work as micro entrepreneurs, and also sometimes are employed by someone and get a monthly pay. So there you also have a variety of working arrangements. Maybe they are not official, they have no official contract, but they also have different forms of remuneration. So they are both working with new technologies, and they are, in that sense, part of currently fast-growing digital economies in the service sector in both cities, Abidjan and Berlin. And in the literature, these kinds of forms of work are often discussed as precarious for the case of Berlin, and as new forms of informal work in the case of Abidjan. And this is often equated with, there's a very smooth equation. Okay, they are precarious and informal, so that they are marginal. And this equation I want to challenge, and I want to ask. How the informal and precarious work is articulated with enduring material and social insecurity, because this is a particular form of precarious and informal work, which I call also unstable work, that is not for everyone in the same way causing material and social insecurity. And I want to understand what is actually mediating, what are the mechanisms that cause an entrapment in this material and social insecurity if you are doing this kind of activities. So I think that taking the status of activity as a unit of analysis is one way of doing, and we could then maybe say, okay, we compare both working conditions and identify income, legal work contract, and rights to state-delivered welfare and the freedom for people to express their opinions. We could take this as a starting point for comparing both contexts. But I think that is problematic, because then we had always standards developed from a perspective of Europe that are institutionalized in the international organizations, and we would maybe define, this is less precarious, this is more precarious, but I think we can do more. And if you want to have a more sociological perspective, or no, not a more sociological perspective, but I think a more global perspective on this, we could maybe use relational sociology and to start to look at social mechanisms and practices of how young adults make a living. And so here I use Chile's Tilly's understanding of inequality as a relation between persons or a set of persons in which the interaction generates greater advantages for some than for others. And so inequality results from unequal control over value-producing resources. And that can provide tools to give a nuanced picture of the marginality produced in unstable work settings, and helps to find mechanisms that are similar across cases, even though they may not work in the same way in Abidjan and in Berlin. And so one example of a mechanism is opportunity hoarding, for example. And so I argue that we need to move away from formal labor as the starting point for indicating social positions, but to embed work in the life course and in practices of organizing livelihood. And this implies to overcome the market paradigm and definitions of the economic. So what I refer to by that is the predominance of the idea of an homo economicus and of the market or the economic as defined by a market in which the price or the value of things is defined accordingly to supply and demand. I know that economic sociology has like a lot of criticism on the market paradigm, but I just take it as one of the maybe more economist understandings of inequality and of studying labor that I want to criticize by using Bourdieu'ian approach to practices, and his early work on like more anthropological work on the Algerian worker in the transition, in the capitalist transition, in the early century, 20th century. And I'm also influenced by Polanyi, who I think already gives a good understanding of the economic, because he integrates market and non-market economies by reminding us of the fact that we can also integrate forms of economic integration that are reciprocity, redistribution, and exchange. I won't go into the detail, but just to give you an idea that we can maybe use all kinds of economic practices to understand how inequalities are articulated through work. And so for me, I want to study economic practices that are practices that organize the satisfaction of human needs in a specific context, the means and mechanisms through which people try to make ends meet. And next to a broadening of the economic beyond market exchange, it allows me also to not only include resources generated through work, but also those organized as rights to a share, in practices of gifting, of caring, for example. And these means to make a living are not distributed equally, and so to understand inequalities, we can look at these economic practices and what are the mechanisms that are then reproducing unequal access to resources. Yes, and I also draw on Pierre Bourdieu and his understanding of the economic and including all kinds of goods, also smiles and handshakes and shrugs that are also important resources sometimes, and sometimes it matters more to build symbolic capital than to build wealth in terms of income. Okay, you seem to know all this, but I think it's a very interesting way to build comparative work. Okay, I already have, yes, perfect. Because I don't want to now give all the empirical analysis, because it would take really a long time, but maybe as a starting point to give results, what I have found by crafting these connections between airtime sellers and riders in Berlin, I say that airtime sellers and food delivering are activities situated in an attempt to build value as person, not only as a person selling labor power. And here I think what you just presented is very intriguing, because it shows that the labor studies have often talked about the value of a person as selling labor power, but especially by looking at the case of the airtime sellers, it's really important to also build wealth in people. For example, this concept developed by anthropologists in African studies. So and also in the gig economy, we see a delinking of what you, I think, also said, of participation in society and your status as worker. So I think there is a common thread that we can maybe think together, and so it is very important to participate in economies of redistribution, for instance. And second, I show that the activity does not per se as an indicator for material and social insecurity, precariousness, but explanations why some face risks of enduring precarity can be found in studying the following mechanisms of social closure amongst the young workers, and in these mechanisms of social closure, that is opportunity hoarding, symbolic economies matter, so what kind of personhood is valued, and here the ideal of flexibility, for example, is one norm that excludes people who have not the means and resources to actually live such a flexible life, but yeah, I can't go into detail. And second, unequal access to resources at work. Even though it's a work setting in which tracking, evaluation, and new technologies are regulating the labor process, I would stress that personal bonds are crucial, and practices of gifting and caring, becoming familiar to co-workers is probably difficult because of the dispersed character of the work, but it's very important to access resources at work. And third, mechanisms of secondary exploitation. Here I refer to Dörre, who is a German labor sociologist. I detect those mechanisms because private resources become essential in the work process, and that privileges those who have access to family assets. And here, norms of deservingness are, for example, one of these symbolic economies that then also are important to look at in order to understand why some can access these private resources and others not. And this was all that I wanted to present now, and I hope next time I can maybe elaborate a bit more on the concrete empirical case, and I'm happy to discuss what I just presented. Thank you for listening.
Thank you the participants. And I'll just briefly try to see what we have done so far. It seems to me that what is at stake is that how the modernity unfolds and what is the human futures in it. And at the heart of that modernity, as we know from the work of Max Weber and all of them, is the uncertainty which capitalism tries to convert to risk and insurance. At the heart of that problem is obviously, when it comes to the labor, is that modernity strips us of all kind of means of productions, and the perfect polarization where the concentration of means of production and what we are left with is our own capacity to labor, and through which we try to make our life and make sense of that living. So what happens in this process of the history of capitalism, as Lizzie has taken us, is that the very emergence of factory as an enclosed space where the particular type of production was organized, and then with the development of technology it becomes flexible, and then responding to the demand and supply of the market. What comes out of that process is a control that capital has over this production process, and then it seems through the various kind of political intervention where people try to gain control over the life, there was a new form of inflexible understanding where we have a shift in the temporality of the work condition, where we gain some control over the work that we do in the factory, and whether we can actually retain some time for family time, taking care of the children, and do all of that, and not being constricted by the factory or any office time. And it seems that what the genealogy that Lizzie presents to us is the very flexibility of the term flexible, the various changes that it has gone through, and then what we have right now is the technological changes, is the dispersion and the one might also call a deterritorialization and reterritorialization of the work, where it gets much more dispersed, and the capital cost needs to be brought down, where the people come to the workforce with their own private resources, which you also find in the work of Hannah. And what at the heart of PS is the intensity of the casualization, the part-time work, and the informalization within which capital reorganizes the labor. And so what it points perhaps to, and I would like to invite you to reflect on, is that whether we are looking at a new form of labor reserve from where capital can continuously draw in the labor and keep the at control. So what we also and that brings me to Hannah's paper, which seems to be the very problematic of that human future. What we do as a labor if we don't have our own resources, but we then depend on capitalism to make sense of our life. And it seems that particularly what happens here is that the process of individualization which neoliberalism has brought in and globalization, where particularly a first world problem has perhaps developed, where various kind of the social cost of reproduction and the consumerism is much lower, because the first world gets to exploit this enormous mass of labor all over the world, and that perhaps has given rise to a millennial condition where you have all these aspirations and ambitions of being a filmmaker and floating around in the city, but what you are basically as a laborer is that completely a precarious labor, trying to make living by selling whatever this time that you do. And what it also seems, what this particular case study, and I would again like you to push into it, whether there is a stigmatization which the long history of Europe over the working class is the stigmatization of the working class of an identity of being a worker. And that seems to be what your workers are trying to avoid when they say that we are not selling our labor time then, but we are doing something else. What exactly are you doing? You are obviously selling your labor for nothing else. So that stigmatization in the first world about the very identity of the working class. And it seems to me that the process is, as expected, is reversed in India, where you could be as a human being is to gain your respect and reputation through the skills that you develop and mastery over that as an ustad in that factory space. It's simply that very limited space within which you can get recognized. The moment you step outside and go back to your society, the society is caught up into its own set of social relationships where it brings, which doesn't share those things, where the universality of that of labor and working identity, and through that perhaps merit, etc., that simply doesn't hold, because your recognition mechanisms are different. There is masculinity, there is an understanding of some different form of not the capacity of the labor, but perhaps of the masculinity of the body, which then emerges, not the skills that the body has. And within that, I think most of our panelists were struggling for the time, and I was not very flexible. So of course we can't be, because food is waiting, and so I will invite questions for the
Right. I mean, I don't know where they are located within the caste hierarchy, in different places, in different ways. Because when you are talking about ethical, you gave us a standard definition, but you didn't tell us what ethical, what is ethical for them, from where they actually draw the conception of ethical. What does it mean in the local context? And maybe you could think of how it is, because in anthropology, everyone is talking about ethical term now. Moral economy. I understand that what you are talking is totally different sort of idea of ethical. So what does it mean? Ethos, but there is a much larger ethical term by which, on the basis of morality, local conception of morality, people try to understand the whole society. In terms of work and ethics, I wonder how it is different from, let's say, Protestant ethics.
Yeah, very quick to Lizzie and Hannah. Since the flexibility is an interesting point. In India also we are now celebrating the flexibility kind of a discourse. But here it turns out that too much flexibility also brings down too much self-exploitation and coercion. And here the flexibility, the kind of work you're doing, not only precarious, they are all precarious, but also more about the self-exploitation, the kind of app-based worker are doing. So what is your opinion? Or what do you think?
Anyone else? Yes.
Obviously, from Qureshi, sometimes Fakir, Locas. Some Loas are there. Fishbaka Loas. They often are factory or workshop owners, in fact. But I mean, it's close by community because it's mostly Loas, Sikhs, and some craftsmen or butchers, Muslim caste. It's not only Loas. So about ethics of works, I do not at all want to enter into the moral economy. And I take efforts to not have kind of, for me, at least in the historian, because then Fassin is saying good things on moral economy, but it would be something encompassing everything, which I want to avoid, because this is, you refer to the Protestant ethics, right? But it's very different because it is circumspect to some kind of line. It doesn't go outside the line. Then it was common, if you remember my last presentation, that was a bit common in both construction yard and metal workshop. But still, the metal workshop, I think they are upper than the construction yard, and also this was even more important there. But it's really circumscribed, and it's also come with tensions, you know. I couldn't develop all the tensions, but you have so many, you know. Also between the masculine identity at work and the fact that it can be valorized, you know, that your son who would have an ocre which would be feminized. So it's not, it doesn't work like a system. But within work, I say ethics at one point, because it's not just a bunch of hypotheses which are embodied, that there is, this discourse, and that's why it comes back in almost every multiple presentation, this discourse on labor, on skills, is something which is defining what is a good worker. And there is like kind of convention on this thing. And if you want me to go, I don't know if you want, but I'll go into the community, then for the law it's really unique, because they don't have the time to develop, but the most valuable skill is the image of the object. And for the Muslim, well, they just say, well, I'm good to have the image of the object in my mind, and that makes me very skilled, because it's the most valuable skill. But for the Lohars, what we say is the darshan shishpa karma that I have by birth. So this is coming to the karma that really fix you.
Okay. So
Okay, yeah, thank you. Is it a way to avoid the stigma of the working class? It's a good question. So.
whether the work is stigmatized, the
Yes.
idea of being a working class is stigmatized in Europe.
I can't speak for Europe in general, but I can just
Germany,
say
Berlin, or the state.
that the case I studied, the delivery riders, they are very heterogeneous, and maybe that also can immediately address your question on the raised character of this work, or how they are placed racially in the labor market. So this is a work that is not stigmatized in the traditional working class perspective, I would say, because of the work of the companies to celebrate it as flexible and easy to do. You don't need to actually in Berlin, cycling is culturally marked as a practice also of distinction. So a lot of those who want to become filmmaker, they actually ride their fixies and think that it's really fun and a game, and they make races, like bicycle races, and for them they don't
And they film that.
yeah, and they don't mark it as work, not to avoid maybe to avoid a stigma. Is a really interesting question, but for them it's a way of building up an identity not as worker but as someone belonging to the urban milieu of those who are part of the city. Berlin, the hub of cultural economy. They want to belong to this economy, and in that sense, it's at the margins of this economy. It's a startup. It's like it's really not, it's a hip thing, and that disguises the labor done, and it also places those who cannot do this as a side job and study on the side. There are a lot of students taking this job. So for example, here you have the racial inequalities coming in, because a lot of migrants also can do this job because they have no, maybe because the access to this job is not very strictly regulated. You don't need to prove any skills. You don't need to even, some people have precarious permits, residential permits, can do this job because they don't care really. So you just apply online. But then it entraps them in a situation of precarity, of material and social insecurity, because they cannot make any qualifications. They have to work a lot to make a living because it's really low paid. So they cycle a lot, they get exhausted, they have health problems because it's really exhausting if you do this longer than maybe a year. So some have to then quit and have no, and during this time they have accumulated not at all any cultural capital that is institutionalized and recognized by the state. So I think in that sense it's a problem, and the companies and all the students who can do this really as a game on the side and then rely on their studies and on their families, who can give their money and phones and new bicycles that are easy and that are really good quality, they can further accumulate their advantages. And this is what I want to point to, because it also creates a difficulty to actually mobilize as workers. They are so dispersed that labor struggles are very difficult, because everyone has a different interest, and that is why I think it's a very difficult work situation. I have spoken too much, but I think I have already basically answered all the questions.
Okay. If I understood your point correctly, it was to do with a new form of reserve labour, or was that? I mean, I don't know. What I didn't really, I'm not sure that I managed to convey, but I think that there's two aspects of this which I've been looking at slightly more empirically, and I think from this case of in the UK self-employed delivery rider, self-employed contractor through a platform. I think you can see this as a pool of labour that is flexibly kind of mobilised through this kind of digital app. And I think exactly as Hannah was saying,
my point is that what allows this flexibility?
Yeah.
You can organize labor in 1,000 types of ways, but what is it that allows?
Well, I mean, I think, and someone said this earlier today, there's a kind of, in this instance you could call it a form of mediation between employer or a new form of mediation, or a changing kind of relationship between what was employer and employee in the UK context, and a new way of not entirely new, but increasing forms of mediation or alteration of that relationship in that instance. But I think in the other instance that I kind of worked on a bit more, which is actually workers in office contexts, but also other forms of kind of knowledge and creative work, which, coming back to the point of coercion and self-exploitation, these have conventionally been forms of work which are not kind of mobilised not sort of mobilised on demand, as it were, but these are people who are choosing, potentially in contractual conditions, choosing to work long hours, choosing to kind of work flexibly in that way. And I don't think that's necessarily the same. That's not kind of it's mobilising additional labour power, but it's not in this kind of the same sense as in the first case.
I would like to add something, just because it comes in my mind now. I think what makes possible also is to look at, we need to look at the dismantling of the welfare state. I know that a lot of riders have started this job because and their social benefits were so low or so stigmatized that they preferred to earn money on the side, like really small money. It's not really a job for them. It's a way of, oh, I needed a wash machine, I couldn't afford, I didn't want to ask someone, and I started this job. And I think that is one of the drivers that also people want to have this flexibility, and they then get aware of, oh no, it was not so good in the end, actually, that I started this job, because it's very, it takes a lot of time. And yeah, so I think we need to combine it with also the changing welfare state. And in Abidjan, that is similar. I have already told this in the other presentation, that the relation to the state and this compromise between wage and welfare, that it changes, and that makes people also organize their lives differently, that they have to work and earn money.
Any other questions, concerns, takeaways?
Just as a last
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if it was really a question or a remark when you evoked the fact that it was the other way around in India. Like you could hang out, like you remark, if I remember well, you could hang out to skills in the productive sphere, but then it comes back to other forms of recognition outside the productive sphere. But I mean, I wanted to be disessentialist and not functionalist, but still there is a lot of Bourdieusian amor fati, like doing bad necessity virtue in all of this, and all the way these hypotheses are moving. So it has to be taken the other way around, that people don't have status within contracts. They are not assured. So in fact, if you take search program separation between, I think you're going to pay to India, it's on Durkheim, the two great forms of recognition, which are social protection and status, and then having a recognition for the sense of your work. Well, they don't have much, they just have the sense of work, and they are pretty lucky in the informal sector, that's a skilled job as well.
So, if there's no other questions and other things, then we'll formally close it. And thank you very much. I will now hand over to Sumit to proceed.
I just have one announcement that the dinner is ready. But before that, I would really like to formally thank you all for making it to Jindal. And what was arranged, and the cab drivers really reached on time, and also for the whole arrangements today. And so I would really like to thank her, and also Sunita, who is not here. She was also initially helping me with the conference. So I would really like to thank both of them. And without taking any of the time, I would like you all to come straight to the diner. Thank you.
I think that you have done a